When I criticize or when I'm skeptical of nationalism, nationalists sometimes tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about. And, well, they could be right. It could be that we are just talking past each other. I'm not sure. So I was sent this video entitled Making Sense of Nationalism from Keith Woods. So let's listen to it and just respond. I was going to put this guy at 1.25, 1.5 speed, but maybe you want to do that to the both of us.
All right, welcome everyone. What I wanted to cover today, and this may become a series of videos, is the academic treatment of nationalism. Now, it's kind of interesting in circles where nationalism is discussed. The academic treatment of nationalism is rarely discussed at all. The kind of academic discussion that goes on around nationalism, that's something that's very separate from kind of the nationalist community. And in a way, it's understandable why. Someone that's been through the university system, um, through a sociology course, when nationalism is discussed, it's generally in a very dismissive way. And the kind of debate around nationalism isn't covered so much. Instead, what's presented generally is the summary of the modernist school. And the modernists basically say that nationalism was an invention of elites during and after the Industrial Revolution. That is a kind of false consciousness created by uh, modern mass society and education methods. In this regard, Ernest Gellner and Eric Hobsbawm are the two most influential thinkers. Hobsbawm was a Marxist historian, Gellner a sociologist. Um, and this was the dominant school of thought for a long time. But there are other.
That's what I tend to believe. Maybe I'm just brainwashed. Maybe that's because that's what it is. I mean, just look at some of these. Now, I'm not saying that nationalism necessarily was created by the elites to manipulate us, right? But that has also definitely happened. I mean, just look around, right?
Schools of thought, primordialism, the idea that nationalism has
I understand that's not an argument, right? But do you have eyes?
always been around in some sense, uh, or the kind of ethnogenesis approach to nationalism. Um, People that focus on the cultural symbolism aspect. But the guy I want to talk about today is called Walker Connor, and I think he's a good starting point because Connor's focus in the 70s and 80s when he wrote most of his essays was to undo a lot of the misunderstandings that he saw within the academic community about nationalism.
And even if that's the case all the time, that elites stir up, create this sort of nationalistic sentiment in the population in order to steer them a certain way. But that doesn't mean that it's wrong, right? I mean, it's how you use it, right? I do admit that unfortunately a lot of people out there just aren't able to take care of themselves, right? In many cases, they're not really able to think for themselves. They just want to be, given something to do, a hot meal, and a paycheck at the end of the month, right? So, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't know, there's always going to be leaders in society, right? Just like in the animal kingdom or an ant colony, right? Division of labor, whatever the hell you want to call it. Um, it doesn't inherently make it wrong. The fact that there are leaders, right? Spiritual, ideological, or whatever leaders, political.
And a lot of the mistakes that crop up time and time again, because if someone who understands nationalism looks at the academic discussion of it when they're not just dismissing it out of hand, they tend to make a number of kind of rudimentary errors. Like something you'll see a lot is
Errors, right? So this guy here won't make any, right?
misuse of the term nation. Nation will get conflated with the term state. Um, it may get conflated with the term ethnos and vice versa. Patriot.
Now, I don't know if academics do this. Probably some. I don't know if academia in general does this, but like, yeah, the rank and file people on the street, you and I, yeah, you see this a lot. This is true, right? So, nation are the people, right? It's not the state, technically. But the question I would ask is, can you have this idea, ideology of nationalism without a central authority, without the physical state? Does that actually happen, right? Give me some examples if it does, because I could give you tons of examples where they go hand in hand, probably more, right?
Patriotism and nationalism are often used interchangeably. Nation state will be used for any state. Um, so there's all of these terminological issues that is a sign of kind of a deeper misunderstanding of nationalism and the basis for nationalism. So Walker Connor kind of revolutionized academic discussion on nationalism by basically highlighting these errors and putting things in their proper context. And so he became one of the founders of what's called nationalism studies. And it was the work of Walker Connor that really made a lot of academics take nationalism more
Is he an academic?
seriously as a phenomenon and say, okay, maybe this kind of basic Marxist account of things is leaving a lot of stuff out. So in that regard, I think he's interested. Now, maybe some of this will seem very basic to some people, but nevertheless, I think it's a good intro. And where Walker Connor excels really is showing how modern academia misunderstands nationalism so badly. And why is it that they can so readily dismiss this force that seems so powerful and so
Now, I don't know what the view of the Marxist is of nationalism, right? But it seems to me like we're stuck in this false left right paradigm here, right? Where you have the Marxists on the left and you have the nationalists on the right, right? Whereas I talked about this, I'm not the only one to ever talk about it, but this political spectrum is bullshit because both nationalism on the right, right, and any Marxist influenced form of government, if you will, ideology on the left, they're both collectivist, right? So if you have collectivism on the left and collectivism on the right, that leaves no room for individualism, right? The spectrum doesn't even allow for individualism, right? It's all leftist, right? Or it's all left, it's all collectivist, right?
influential.
So this guy is stuck in this false, in my opinion, uh, political spectrum, right? That's very, very limited. It's just one little part of it. It's all the left, right? And I've dedicated a lot of time on this channel talking about how and proving to you, right, that the left right paradigm as it exists in the mainstream, it's all leftism, right? Because whereas you have conservatism on the right and the progressives on the left, let's say, right, the progressives progress, they they initiate the change and the conservatives conserve those changes, right? So it all moves to the left ultimately.
In so many people's lives. So that is Walker Connor. As I say, one of the most influential people when it comes to the discussion of nationalism and someone who provides kind of a different perspective than is typical. And of course, the first issue,
So I would say that's error number one, right? Accepting this false paradigm.
as I said, is the terminological issues. Walker Connor wrote this book, by the way, The Quest for Understanding Ethno-Nationalism. It's a collection of essays, speeches that Walker Connor gave, and really all of his key arguments are in there. So that's where all of the quotes from Walker is the consequence of a much broader terminological disease that plagues the study
The error of improperly equating nationalism with loyalty to the state is the consequence of a much broader terminological disease
of global politics.
that plagues the study of global politics. So, what would that be? Confusing nationalism with statism?
It would be difficult to name four words more essential to global politics than our state, nation, nation state, and nationalism. But despite their centrality, all four terms are shrouded in ambiguity due to their imprecise, inconsistent, and often totally erroneous usage. So, uh, again, you probably can think of plenty of examples.
So, if two different parties define terms differently, right? And they talk to one another using these terms, they're probably talking past each other, right? But who's right? Who's wrong?
Of how people use these terms interchangeably in an unhelpful way. But the most obvious one is
Now, maybe he could prove me wrong, right? But at this point in time, it seems like my definition is right and yours is wrong because I say so. Well, again, maybe he has a justification that will be universally acceptable. Let's see.
is conflating nation with state, and this is where you get a lot of critiques of nationalism that kind of presuppose some of these terminological confusions. Like people will criticize nationalism on the basis of it being loyalty to a state, and they may critique our modern notion of the state, or they'll say that this makes nationalism um, bound up with a certain liberal conception of the state. These kinds of arguments, a lot of times, um, it's just people using two different definitions of nationalism, and so they're kind of talking past each other. But the most obvious one is conflating nation with the state. Now, Walker Connor says that this probably developed because they were alternatively used as just abbreviations for the term nation state. Actually, nation states are a small number. I think when in one of the essays he wrote, he estimated at the time that there were 12 nation states in the world. So what he means by a nation state is, I guess, what we would more commonly call an ethno state. A state that is
So, like Israel, Ireland, Poland, I don't know. What else?
built around um, the national identity of an ethnic group. But we use nation state and interchangeably. We call any state a nation state just in everyday language. And you have something like international relations, which says that it's the study of interactions between nations. What actually is the study of interactions between states. So that's one example, pretty clear in academia, of how this kind of confusion arises. Scholars assumed new states in Africa and Asia would command national loyalty like European states. So this is another thing Walker Connor highlighted, is that academics and NGO workers and so on really had a lot of false assumptions about Africa and Asia. And when they engaged in what they called nation building, but again, what's more properly called state building, because they misunderstood nationalism, they thought that they could transfer a lot of these things to Africa and Asia. They thought that, why wouldn't a new state, a post-colonial state created in Africa, generate the same kind of national loyalty and national consciousness as Germany? Well, Germany is populated by Germans that have a German national consciousness. Um, and so if you presume
Where did that German national consciousness come from, right? would the state impose that onto these people? Now, I'm not saying that there weren't, related, that these people aren't related to one another necessarily, right? But ultimately, at the end of the day, what Germany is a bunch of, well, first and foremost, Germanized Slavs, right? And a whole bunch of different nations, I would say, tribes, right? That were invaded and conquered by, the Franks, the Saxons, and they were all united into Germany, right? He wants to call it some kind of German consciousness when that didn't really happen till something like, I forget, 125 or something like that, a century and a quarter ago, right? Germany didn't even exist. I mean, they'll tell you now that, Germany is 1,000 years old or something. No, it's not, right? That was the Holy Roman Empire. Germany is I mean, it was Prussia before, right? Prussians were Balto-Slavs, right? But somehow Prussia, right? Those Balto-Slavic people were ethnically cleansed, and these so-called, today we call them Germans, right? Took on their identity, called themselves Prussians, right? Because that was the state, I guess. Or they created this state called Prussia, except they spoke German, and then that later morphed into Germany, right? Which didn't exist up until very, very recently in historical terms. So it's like, to completely discount the central authority influencing what this nation is to completely ignore history.
Assume that the state comes before the nation, that the nation is just downstream from the state.
And that's exactly what happened with Germany, right? Even the name was given to them by the Romans, right? Germania. They assumed that name many. I mean, it took millennia, but they finally assumed that, or they were told that this is who you are, right?
Then you're going to assume that nation building is a pretty easy enterprise. And you're going to assume that you can just transfer the European model onto other parts of the world. But Walker Connor correctly predicted that this would face a lot of challenges. And that's
Because it faced a ton of challenges in Europe, right? It took 1,000 years to even get Polish people to call themselves Polish, to get Germans to call themselves German. It took hundreds and hundreds of years for these borders to be defined somewhat permanently, and all these different people to get lumped together as one nation. All these various tribes, right? That to this day speak different variations of the same language, or downright different. It really depends on where you draw the line, right? What's a different language? But even if you look inside of Poland, you have all these dialects, right? There's there's some tribes, right, in Poland that they could barely understand one another. Now they've been more or less ethnically cleansed, assimilated, blah blah blah. Yeah. But there's still, in as small of a country as Poland, you have certain tribes, certain people that would be completely lost talking to a different tribe, if you will, of people from the same nation, supposedly, because they couldn't communicate very well.
one of the reasons he's respected is because his predictions proved to be so prescient. In equating nationalism with loyalty to the state, scholars did not look at how many cases of fanatical devotion to the state existed outside of nation states. So again, the study of nationalism, um, people will look at Japan, Germany in World War II, and we'll look at the kind of fanatical devotion that people had to the state. And again, people will try and universalize this. Um, but again, within the academic context, they ignore the fact that this is really Um, this is a national loyalty rather than a state loyalty. The state happens to be the embodiment of the national group in in that context. Um,
The state, like the Japanese state, right, engaged in a campaign of racism against other Asian people, closed down the borders to keep outsiders out, had this national myth of essentially a racist myth, right? We're the people of the sun, we're better than everybody else, right? Um, so, how are we just ignoring the state in the creation of a national identity? How? What about the Ainu people that populated uh, some of the islands in Japan? Maybe even the mainland, even, right? What about the well, white or mixed Japanese, right? Ainu, the people that could grow beards, right? They're Japanese now. Well, what made them so? Well, the sword of the state.
but this is not something that just transfers to any states, as some scholars of nationalism had assumed. So,
Right, because you need a really powerful military, uh, a strong ideological, I would guess, arm of the state, like the educational system, so on and so forth. You need to put all these institutions in place that will create a, a fake, essentially, an artificial nation, right? That's Japan. Japan is an ethno state, supposedly. Yeah, because they ethnically cleansed the Ainu and whoever else was there, right?
Connor is going to lay out his own definitions of these terms that we use all the time, which I think is important because once you have some kind of basic definitions,
And to me, you start to see a monster such as Nazi Germany, right? Coming out of this sort of ideology, or Imperial Japan, right? Or look at Israel, what they're doing to some of the inhabitants of that land, right? This sort of, I mean, I'm not gonna say that, they just go hand in hand. I'm not saying that one creates the other, or I don't know what is the chicken, what is the egg, right? Both, I guess. But yeah, this nationalism, right? These examples that he's giving of nationalism gave rise to go hand in hand with very, very ethnicist, racist, authoritarian, murderous central governments and states. Like they just go hand in hand. But and well, they're just downright evil. Some of them, right? Like what the Japanese did to, again, the Ainu and even the Chinese, right? What the Germans did to Slavs and also Jews, right? Like uh, is this even based in morality at all, right? If it's not good, then it's no good, right? Where are these? Where's this good nationality, right? These examples he's giving are fucked up.
to see what a house of cards the whole academic discussion of this is built on, because almost every step along the way they have bad definitions, conflating things, misunderstanding certain key terms, and that's really the basis for a whole lot of other misunderstanding.
And you're completely ignoring the historical perspective and the evils of nationalism.
So, as far as ethnicity, obviously ethnicity is derived from ethnos, the Greek word for nation, um, a group characterized by common descent. Consonant with this derivation, there developed a general agreement on an ethnic group referred to a basic human category, i.e., not a subgroup. That's kind of a basic definition of ethnicity. Is uh, just a basic human category. You can't kind of subdivide the Pashtuns into a smaller ethnic group. An ethnic group may be readily discerned by an anthropologist or other outside observer, but until the members are
Now, I don't know about the Pashtuns, but they're probably a tribe, right?
themselves aware of the group's uniqueness, it is merely an ethnic group and not a nation.
At one point, you could have taken the Germans and divided them into a whole bunch of different tribes, right? Now you can't. Why not? Well, because of the state and the aforementioned ideological brainwashing and ethnic cleansing.
While an ethnic group may therefore be other defined, the nation must be self defined. So this explains what's the difference between an ethnicity and a nation. What's the difference between the nation of Ireland and the ethnic group, the Irish people? Because we've already said that the nation of Ireland isn't just the state of Ireland, right? But then if we're kind of bringing it to ethnicity, well, why isn't it just an ethnic group? Well, the ethnic group is something objective. Um, an anthropologist can look and see that this group, the Irish people, exists, but maybe uh, no Irish people have a sense of being Irish. Maybe they identify with um, their local parish or their religion or something, and they don't consider themselves Irish, hypothetically. Well, they'd still be an ethnic group. They become a nation once they self-define. So you see, the ethnic group is something objective, and this is key. The nation is something that has a subjective element, self-defining. So self-differentiating ethnic groups once they self-define. So you see, the ethnic group is something objective, and this is key. The nation is something that has a subjective element, self-defining. So self-differentiating ethnic groups are nations, and this is Walker Connor's definition.
So a nation isn't necessarily or only based on genetics.
Self-differentiating ethnic groups are in fact nations. Loyalty to the ethnic group should therefore be called nationalism. So, as you can see already, this is kind of a radical departure from what we're used to hearing in typical discussions about nationalism. This is important because the fact that he brings in this subjective element is something that's rarely seen in academia around discussions, and so you have endless discussions. I mean, I've been reading books about nationalism in an academic context, and really everyone has their own definition of a nation. I think Joseph Stalin said a definition that the Marxists like to use, that it's about common language and descent. But you see, you read different definitions of nationalism, and some of them include language, some of them don't. Some of them include religion, some of them don't. They've got all of these different objective characteristics, and no one can really see what is the essence. What Walker Connor says. Problem is, they're looking for this kind of anthropological, purely objective understanding of a nation, when actually what defines it is the subjective element. It's the fact that the ethnic group of the Irish people all feel that they're Irish, and they feel that there's this kind of spiritual unity.
And I think that's, sorry about that. This I could be wrong, but I don't see how these people can feel to be Irish without somebody uh, giving them this idea, right? Subjectively. Um, he seems to be, maybe I'm not getting this, but he seems to be implying that people just organically all have the same idea at the same time on their own, and there's potentially millions of them. They all just, I mean, maybe we'll get to it, but how does this concept of a nation arise, right?
Feel that there's
Because he wants to deny that it has anything to do with the state, that it's somehow the people self-define. Well, how, right? How do they? How does this one idea cross, you know, hundreds of miles, sometimes even thousands, maybe not thousands, but hundreds of miles, and happen in everybody's head at the same time without a puppet master? How does this happen, right? Because the way we communicate, and I'm also talking about moving about, traveling, right? When I say communicate, it is very much limited. Oh, maybe less so now, maybe more so now, or we're heading in that direction, but it's very much limited. So how do these ideas spread if people themselves don't go everywhere within any one nation? People tend to stay in the same place in a very small radius in their own little neighborhood, right? And yet somehow this idea that these people that never leave their, their little town or neighborhood somehow have the same idea of a nation, the same nation as somebody that's hundreds of miles away, and there's nothing connecting them, right? Except for a central authority, right? A school system, uh, churches, whatever, some kind of a central authority that provides this ideology for them. I don't see how it's self-defined, because if people were to truly just do for self, and they're, I think the most, and I think this is the belief in anthropology, right? Uh, Self-definition when it comes to group encompasses 1,000, maybe a couple thousand people tops, a tribe, right? And anything past that, you need, I would think, some kind of an institution to link all those different tribes or maybe even nations together, right? To conglomerate them. How does it happen, right? How do 20 million people across hundreds of miles, how do they all, how do they self-define to be that one specific thing? How does that happen?
There's this kind of spiritual unity that creates
Ghosts, right? Spirits. Okay.
the Irish nation. And this, I think, really explains a lot of the problems in discussing nationalism, is the fact that the subjective element is ignored. And his definition of nationalism is also quite interesting, because he just defines it as loyalty to the ethnic group. Now, this is contentious. I think a lot of people would reject this, because you could say that nationalism, and this is the argument, is bound to a specific state form. Now, this, when I did a video on nationalism before, this was basically
That is the world that we live in, right? These artificial borders imposed, drawn by agreed upon central authorities, states, more or less confine these so-called nations, don't they? I'm not saying this is perfect, but that's what they want.
the definition I used. I hadn't encountered or heard of Walker Connor at that point, but this was
Somebody wants this, right? Not the globalists don't, but somebody wants this.
my own kind of definition of nationalism is loyalty to the extended ethnic group. And of course, the people that responded to that video, leftists that responded and deconstructed it, said I was just a complete idiot for not understanding that nationalism means
Again, he calls people leftists when, well, you're a leftist, right? You're on the left.
specific 18th century state form, and it's a specific liberal kind of ideology bound up with having a certain state form and having the people connected to that state form in a certain way.
So liberalism isn't, maybe I'm wrong here, but that's not leftism, right? Liberalism, and I'm not saying that like it's perfect or anything. At least the way I understand its origins was about the individual, right? And the liberty to, you know, do things. A certain kind of freedom, right? It's not the same as freedom, but it encompasses freedom also, right? Freedom of the individual. So I wouldn't be so quick to say that liberalism is leftism, right?
Um, and from a certain perspective, I think you could argue that's a definition of nationalism. Certainly nationalism is kind of a new idea. Um, and I think you could say, I mean, in a way, you could almost say there's two nationalisms. There is the nationalism as an ism, as a universal ideology that says that people, a nation should be the point of sovereignty, should be the locus of sovereignty, and that should be the basis of state formation. Um, but I think in terms of how we use the word nationalism more colloquially, there's a lot to be said for Walker Connor's definition, in that there are advocates for the European group in North America that are not necessarily demanding some ethnically pure nation state, but are simply advocating for their group. And they would kind of universally be termed nationalists and would probably self identify as nationalists. So we see that it can be a little ambiguous again, the connection between nationalism and the state. Now, I'm not sure I'd totally accept Walker Connor's definition here. I mean, I think you can make a case that nationalism as an ism, again, is this universal ideology that does say something about sovereignty in the state. But again, he's trying to clear up terminological confusion. And I think, in terms of how these labels are used, I think this is a fine definition. And I think most nationalists, if we want to clear up confusion and have honest discussions about this stuff, most nationalists are not attached to liberalism or to a specific state form, or to any of these things.
Well, they probably wouldn't be, because liberalism is. Am I getting this right? At least that's how I see it, right? That's more individualistic, right? It liberates the individual, and nationalism is collectivism, right? Which, that's not saying one is good and the other one is bad, right? That's just differentiating between the two.
uh, Most nationalists start with this idea of loyalty to the ethnic group, and then they work their politics out from there. And most of them are not necessarily committed to some of
Who defines the ethnic group? The ethnic group itself? Well, I already addressed that, right? Yeah, that's like 1,000, 2,000 people tops.
the ideas they're charged with. So I think this definition is quite helpful in clearing up a lot of confusion. And again, it puts ethnicity at the center, which I think is important for understanding nationalism.
Now, look, with modern communication means, right, mass media, internet, the ability to travel, this, I could see this tribe becoming a lot bigger than in the past, right? Everyone could just be friends on Facebook and blah, 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 blah. But I mean, did we get there organically, right? Without interference or Zuckerberg or whomever, right? Meddling. How do we get to that point, right? Is it still self-defined, right?
So his basic definition of nationalism is that a nation connotes a group of people who believes they're ancestrally related, a self-differentiating ethnic group. And in his words, quote, nationalism connotes identification with and loyalty to one's nation as just defined. It does not refer to loyalty to one's.
Yeah, you can't. People who believe they're ancestry related, right? So once again, organically, if that were to be self-defined, how much of a family tree can any one person remember? How much of a family tree does any one person have? Uh, how far does that go, right, for any individual? At what point does the individual say, okay, you're not part of my family, right? Because our families are, in the best of times, I guess you could say, a family could be, let's say, 100 people, right? And how much bigger than that is your extended family? Well, yeah, 1,000, maybe 2,000 people, right? Not millions of people. Come on.
Country. Admittedly, then, ethno-nationalism has an inner redundancy, and it is used solely to avoid any misunderstanding concerning our focus. So, as I said, the book is about ethno-nationalism, but as he says here, he really thinks ethno-nationalism and nationalism are the same thing. The origin of ethnos, meaning nation. He believes that the nation has always been the ethnos, and so nationalism is just this loyalty to the extended ethnos. So he thinks ethno-nationalism is kind of a redundant term, but he'll use it anyway because obviously there are all these terminological confusions that sometimes it's important to differentiate for clarity. And of course, he separates that from patriotism, which is just patriotism is devotion to one's state and its institutions. So again, a common point of confusion. People just.
I think of patriotism, and knowing Spanish helps to understand it so, as a devotion to a political party, if you will, right? Or motherland, devotion to a piece of land, the state.
confuse the two, patriotism, nationalism. Uh, Walker Connor says the difference is the ethnic element. With but very few exceptions, authorities have shied away from describing the nation as a kinship group and have usually explicitly denied that the notion of shared blood is a factor. So why is this? Again, as I say, whenever there's a discussion of this, it's just conflated with the state. People make a critique of nationalism that's
Right? This is, I think, an admission that it would be ridiculous to just base it on blood and genetics because, well, then we're all one big nation potentially, right? Where do you draw that line? It's a completely arbitrary line, right? At what point does being related end, right? Also, how do you prove that we are or we aren't related by blood, right? You run into these problems. So it has to be an ideology, right? And once again, if it's an ideology, where does it come from? Is it, do we all, millions of us, does this idea of kinship just spring to mind independently and organically uh, in the heads of millions of people that have never met each other and never will, spread over hundreds of miles of land potentially? Or is it are you being brought into the fold by, you know, a few people that control a certain ideology in any geographical area? I don't see how this idea of kinship just is self-defined. I don't see it. But you need to give us an example, right?
basically a critique of patriotism, or a critique of blind loyalty to the state, which most nationalists would agree with. And then you read all of these pages and pages and books upon books of academic deconstructions of nationalism, and many of them never even mention kinship. They never even mention ethnicity. They never even mention relatedness. That's just like some kind of false consciousness. So why? I mean, why is there this huge blind spot that every nationalist recognizes this, but then you have trained, very intelligent academics that have this huge blind spot. Well, Walker Connor also speculated on this. He said that biology became an uncomfortable thing to discuss since the Second World War. And academics often point to the lack of genetic purity within nations, but it doesn't matter if there are genetic differences within the nation. What matters is people consider their nations having a common origin. So again, this is kind of this kind of became a meme in itself. It's kind of a trope, the idea that if you bring up nationalism to someone that's very inculcated with these modern sort of academic sociological modes of thought, that
But that's you, right? You're just in a certain ideological minority, but you are that, right?
they start this deconstruction process where they say, well, there's no such thing as X group, the English, because they're Angles and Saxons, and there's no such thing as the Anglos because they're a mix of this and this group, or
Which is true.
they'll like point that well, your country, how ridiculous is it to be a nationalist because you don't have complete ethnic purity within your nation, all these kinds of things. Um, so it betrays this again, this kind of anthropological objective approach that academics are taking, but what they're ignoring and what's key is the fact that people know what their nation state is, they know what their ethnic group is, and they know it exists, and to
Nation state, right? You can't avoid it.
ignore this subjective element is just kind of juvenile. It doesn't add anything. You have to deal with reality as it is, and you have to deal with people's perceptions of reality, which Walker.
But see, this is what I talk about. What I mean when I talk about nationalism being the step necessary toward a globalism, right? Or all of us being one big human nation. Uh, because according to him, even though he doesn't use these words, necessarily all these words, nationalism is a completely subjective and the line is arbitrary, right? Well, what's the line? Well, the line is drawn by the state with the borders, right? How do you escape? How do you reject it at the same time when you can't escape it?
O'Connor is very good at showing is just ignored by academics. And to emphasize his point, he points out that actually race was often used as a synonym for nation prior to World War II, which is interesting. Um,
And if something is completely subjective and arbitrary, right? Well, then what virtue does it have?
he has to define ethno-nationalists versus nationalists now because there's this terminological confusion. But prior to the Second World War, people would say the French nation and the French race. It was one term and the same. So obviously, there's been a huge shift in the latter half of the 20th century. But belief and shared descent.
So what? Just because a certain people believed something in the past, that makes it somehow more real? That wasn't just an ideology dictated by a central authority?
Is key. A subconscious belief in the group's separate origin and evolution is an important ingredient of national psychology. The anthropologist may prove to his own satisfaction that there are several genetic strains within the Pashtun people. The important fact
Subconscious belief in the group's separate origin and evolution isn't subconscious. I don't know how subconscious this is when you have the states such as Japan propagating this myth that, we came out of the sun and we're better than everybody else, right? Or Hitler doing something similar. I don't know how subconscious this is, but okay.
however, is that the Pashtuns themselves are convinced that all Pashtuns are evolved from a single source and have remained essentially unadulterated. Sociologists tend to focus on outward and objective elements of nationalism and therefore underestimate the strength of subjective feeling and will inspired by nationalism. So next, Walker Connor, he's going to look at types of states. Again, some of this will be very obvious to people, but this is just kind of, sometimes we don't really, we use some of these terms without thinking. But Walker Connor believes it's important to give these kinds of clear definitions. Obviously, there are nation states, which, as I said, when he was writing one of these essays, he estimated there was only like a dozen in the world at the time. And again, this conflation of nation and nationalism and ethno-nationalism, we would call these ethno-states. Nation states are those relatively rare situations characterized by an extremely homogeneous population where a nation has its own state. So again, this shows the problem. This shows exactly what he's talking about, that nation becomes equated to state in the academic discussion around this. And then
Because the state created the nation, right? Before Poland was Poland, it had like tens of different tribes of people who spoke, more or less the same language, sometimes not at all. Again, that depends on, where you draw that line between languages. And they were uh, all conglomerated and unified by the sword, right? They had to do it, um, or the Roman Empire would have swallowed them up, right? They had to unify. Um, that was the pressure that was put on them by Rome, and right, and they were brought into the fold by Roman Catholicism, what became eventually Roman Catholicism, right? Christianity, the Crusades, right? By sword and by fire, created, right? And in many cases, it was a political decision also, right? But it was because of pressures from the outside that these people were, by force, um, put, you know, confined into a geographical area with borders and given a certain identity, right? Like Christian, by a central authority and by force and violence.
we just use nation state for any state.
The shit wasn't organic at all, right? It wasn't self defined at all. I mean, I'm not saying they didn't have an input, but ultimately, the final product was dictated from outside or by a central authority. These people didn't want that. Had they wanted it, they would have done it themselves. They didn't.
And then you get a point where nationalists have to say an ethno nation or an ethno state. to explain this category, which is countries like Iceland, Japan, Poland. Um, you have, of course, multinational states, the first of which is uni homelands. So he says there are different types of multination states. A uni homeland is a multinational state where the ethnic diversity is due to immigration. The homeland people consider the entire state to be their historic homeland. So these are countries that may have once been nation states and been, 95, 99% one ethnic group, but they've been rapidly transformed by immigration. But there's still a majority ethnic group um, that considers that land their homeland. So modern France, UK, Germany. This is really the direction most of Western Europe is going in. They're the best examples. There are multi homelands.
So this is the same thing that's always happened in Europe, right? Except now we're bringing color into it too, right? We're bringing people from it's different because we're bringing people from further away into these states and looking to build those nations. But it's still centrally governed by a central authority process. The borders are still there, the institutions are still there. They're just bringing in more different genetic stock from elsewhere, right? But it's just as artificial as it was in the very beginning.
Another type of multinational state, which represent the largest category according to Walker Connor, and they vary tremendously in the number of homelands they contain. So Nigeria has hundreds of ethnic groups. The Soviet Union, of course, had
Right, and that's Poland, right? Poland was Germany, right? It was a multi-homeland, and Poland became, I guess, an ethno state according to this guy, and Germany became whatever the fuck he calls it. But it's the same process, right? He's describing this process in Africa, not realizing, or the Soviet Union, not realizing that that's exactly what happened to these nation states that he says are somehow, in his mind, probably better, right? But it's the same shit.
all of these ethnic groups, some of which split off after and became, um, like the Baltic states, the Stands. There is the non-homeland, which is a multinational state where the population is overwhelmingly a product of immigration, and it consists of at least two significant groups, each of which is vitally aware of its ethnic difference from the other.
Everybody, if you go far back enough in history, everybody's an immigrant, right? Every every nation or whatever you want to, every people came from somewhere else to where they are now. This is so completely arbitrary, or it's based on political divisions, right?
And is determined to maintain that distinctiveness. So it's not really a kind of modern multicultural state. We're used to the examples he gives are mostly in the Caribbean, like Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and these aren't really a homeland for any one ethnic group. They're immigrant states. Immigrant states are also not homeland states, but with a highly variegated population in terms of ancestry. So states are characterized by a good deal of culturation and assimilation. Walker Connor uses the United States as an example. I'm not sure that's the best example. I think that may fit uni homeland a lot better.
So where did the Germans or the Germanics come from, right? Where did they come from? All over the fucking place. And they were assimilated into eventually what's, and it took like some major world conflicts for that to finally, for Germany to be defined, right? So how is it different? How is this shit different, right? Well, it was here before, so it's better.
In terms of how it was conceived up until the 20th century and then the changes that took place in that self conception, that kind of modern idea of a nation of immigrants. But it's his example. I couldn't really find another example.
It's like he seems to think that people just sprout out of the ground, right? And they're That is their origin, right? They just sprouted wherever. The Japanese just sprouted out of the ground on their little island over there, right? The Poles, the Germans, the Icelandics, they just sprouted out of the fucking ground. No, they didn't come from the Levant, right? They didn't they didn't come from the Mediterranean, right? They're not ancient or descendants of ancient Phoenicians, right? The Icelandics, let's say, mixed with, obviously, right? Obviously, some Asians, right?
Example would be a good case of this. And then there are mestizo states, which are a uniquely Latin American phenomenon. They're characterized by population uh, where people with joint European and Amerindian ancestry are dominant. Now, while he gave them a separate category for analytic purposes, they more resemble multinational states than nation states. And some examples.
Couldn't you say that a place like Romania is that? Couldn't you say that? Couldn't you say that Iceland is that, right? Couldn't you say that? I mean, Chinese chronicles tell us that, well, we went there too, right? Iceland, we were there.
Obviously, the ones highlighted there, places like Mexico, Ecuador. And then there are types of peoples that populate these states. There are pre national nations. There's still a lot of these people in the world for whom national identity is something that may exist in the future, but for now, um, there's still, an anthropological
Pre-national nations. I mean, that seems like a contradiction, right? Is it a nation or is it a pre? Which is it? Which is it? That doesn't even make any sense. There still exist large numbers of people for whom national identity lies in the future. For such people, meaningful identity is still limited to the locale, clan, tribe, and the like. Right? These are the nations. These are the original nations. Before all the politics and central authorities got involved, right? These are the nations, and maybe not even that anymore. But this is as close to a nation as you'll have, right? Self-defined people.
group, but they don't self-identify as a nation. Their identity is limited to their more immediate locality, the clan, the tribe, so on.
They don't identify as a nation. They don't have this concept of a nation. Why? Because no central authority has told them, right? They don't have a school system or some kind of centralized religious institutions to brainwash them with the nonsense, right?
I guess the Pashtun again are probably a good example. There are nations, the largest human group and characterized by a myth of common ancestry. The historical accuracy of the myth is irrelevant. Germany, Ireland, Japan, obviously you can think of loads.
The historical accuracy of the myth is irrelevant, right? So this doesn't have to be based in truth, right? So somebody made up a story, right? And brainwashed people with it. Did millions of people, independent of one another, across hundreds of miles of land, come up with the same bullshit story, right? Which somehow united them? Or did a small group of people come up with the bullshit story and brainwash the millions? Fuck my life.
There are offshoot nations which are formed when an important segment of a nation has been geographically separated from the parent group for a period of time sufficient for it to develop a strong sense of separate consciousness. Members retain an awareness that they derive from the parent stock, but they believe that the characteristics they have in common are less significant than those that make them unique. Um, Good examples are the Afrikaners and the Quebecois. There are diasporas, obviously people living outside their homeland who have not assimilated to the host identity, and members of immigrant societies whose primary sense of loyalty is not to the ethno nation of their ancestors, but to the immigrant society that they're born in. So now looking at this historically, uh,
I don't know how much longer I can do this because this is really frustrating. But he'll criticize the Marxists and the leftists when he himself is a leftist, and this is so obvious, right? Now, some people will say that there is no connection between Marxism, neo-Marxism, and postmodernism. You're right. Okay, nonsense, right? Even if there's no physical connection necessarily, meaning, right, that these people, that the Marxists educated the neo-Marxists, and the neo-Marxists physically, right, in classrooms educated the postmodernists, right? The same sort of ideology morphs and runs through um, all these ideology, unites these ideologies, right? So in that way, it's nonsense to say that. But ultimately, right, we got to a point when it comes to postmodernism, right? Let's say, well, truth doesn't exist, right? Truth is not important; it doesn't exist. Truth, everybody has their own truth, right? You keep hearing these days, right? Some people call that cultural Marxism, right? Where you have boys who could just identify and thus become girls, right? You have Rachel Dolezal who could identify, thus become something other than what she is objectively, right? And this is the same shit, right? It's these myths, right? It's these feelings. It's a subjective feeling and a myth that makes us that which we are somehow objectively, right? This is this is rejecting truth, right? And this is creating your own truth. It's exactly the same, right? I'm trying to tell you guys, he's on the left. He's a leftist, right? I'm not saying he's exactly a Marxist necessarily, but it's all one. When you zoom out far enough, right? I guess you could say that about everything, but not that far. When you just zoom out a little bit, you'll see how what he is that which he criticizes.
and obviously we see that there are ethnic groups who are pre-national, which is an interesting term to use.
Right? Should nationality be based? Maybe that's the wrong way to put it, but wouldn't it make more sense to base it on objective truth and fact, right? If you want to do it by, blood, then again your group is going to be small. If you just do it by blood, right? Genetics. Because there's only so far we can go before that loses its meaning, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we're all related, really, right? Maybe to some degree, or at least huge groups of people are related, right? So shouldn't this loyalty to a group be based on, oh gee, I don't know, the fact that the motherfucker next door grows shit that I need to eat, and I produce shit that he wants to eat, right? Should it be based on the fact that somebody a couple of towns over is producing automobiles and we all need to drive them and he needs to eat, right? And this person won't fucking stab me in the back and take my shit, you know what I mean? But will deal with me in a respectful manner, and a fair one at that, right? We can meet in the marketplace, exchange goods by means of money, right? And we all produce something and contribute to our local economy, and we're all self-sufficient, right? And if somebody comes in from the outside and tries to disturb that, right, we throw them in prison, or we chase them out, or we hang them, or whatever, right, depending on what sort of transgression they commit, right? Shouldn't this nationalism, right, or whatever the fuck you want to call it, pragmatism, wouldn't it make more sense to base it on, well, pragmatic considerations, things that are objectively true, right? If you want to go the bloodline way also, right? But at the same time, like, well, family members could stab you in the back too and take your shit, right? Do people who have this supposedly organic sense of nationalism and loyalty to a group, right? Do they not murder one another? Do they not steal from one another? Do they not uh, do bad things to one another, right? Where's this loyalty? I'd like to know. Where is it?
Um, so Walker Connor wants to look at the history of how groups come to be nations, how they come to be national. But
Finally, let's get it.
because again, he draws some conclusions from this that other academics miss, namely that this process kind of goes one way; it can't really be reversed. Um, the age of nationalism is something that modernists like Gellner and Hobsbawm talk about. And it's often used to say that, show that nationalism is something that's it has a specific starting point. It's very temporal. It'll probably have an end point. It's contingent. It's bound up with the specific ideology, the specific moment in time, the specific incentives of the elites at the time, and something that will pass. Walker Connor explains that ever since the abstract philosophical notion that the right to rule is vested in the people was first linked in popular fancy to particular ethnically defined people, a development which first occurred at the time of the French Revolution, the conviction that one's own people should not, by the very of nature.
So the French Revolution, as I understand it, was a movement fomented by Freemasons from the shadows in order to depose the king's central authority and the power to diminish the power of the church so that they could take over, right? That was the French Revolution. So where's this organic grassroots bullshit? Anyway, I can't do this anymore because this is all based on fucking false historical perspective, ignorance of history, rejection of reality. It's just like feelings, right? Feelings, me, feelings. It's not even pragmatic. It completely disregards the role of the state in the creation of nationalism. It contradicts itself. It says that it criticizes the people on the left while itself being on the left, being a leftist, collectivist ideology that's above the individual, right? The whole political spectrum is like just in my view, right? Maybe I'm the fucking ignorant one, but in my view, this whole presentation, analysis of nationalism is just based on false fucking premises. It's all based on bullshit, right? Anyway, this has gone on long enough. I feel like the more I watch this, the more frustrated I'm gonna get because it's, as I already stated a million times, bullshit. Prove me wrong or don't. I don't know. Look, I don't claim to know everything, right? And maybe, Freemasonry's involvement in the French Revolution, right? Well, maybe that's all bullshit, right? Maybe I've just been lied to, but I just don't see these movements that involve, you know, tens of thousands, millions of people, millions of people. I just fail to see how these are organic, right? As I explained, how does this happen, right? And here he is trying to explain how this shit happens, completely and utterly ignoring the fact that this wasn't a grassroots movement. This was somebody manipulating the people from the shadows. Because that's the world we live in. These idealistic fluff pieces about nationalism somehow being organic. How the fuck does it happen? How? From the beginning to end. Completely and utterly ignoring the fact that these ethno states, he, he's incoherent, right? Because he is criticizing uh, the way in which we create or try to create these ethno states or nations in Africa, when that's exactly how, maybe not exactly, but that's basically the mechanism by which European nation states were formed, right? It was all artificial. It was all done by force, by military powers, conquerors, institutions, right? None of that shit was ever grassroots. How the fuck do you not know this, right? Look at the United States, right? For example, how many people signed the Constitution? And why was it done in secret? I can't do this anymore. This is so fucking frustrating, man. It's just like clearly you have a somewhat intelligent guy, right? Definitely educated, um, brainwashed as fuck. Thanks for watching.